Hi, it's Conor Svensson here, founder and CEO at Web3 Labs. This is a conversation I had with Ken Fromm, founder of BuildETH and director of education at the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. Ken's been involved firsthand through each generation of the web, having co-founded and founded companies focused on Web1, Web2 and Web3. During our conversation, we unpacked the evolution of the web, including the challenges that businesses faced with adopting the early web and parallels with Web3. We also covered the similarities with other disruptive trends, such as serverless, which Ken was also very involved in. Given Ken's breadth of experience, it was great to see how some of the challenges of previous generations of the web apply to Web3, and I'm sure you'll have many, many takeaways from our conversation. Ken, it's awesome to have you here on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So I like to always start by making it personal to learn about people's own individual journeys with Web3. And I'd love to know when Web3 first kind of emerged on your radar, be that a part of the technology, and then at what point you had the conviction where it was, hey, this is more than just an interest. This is something I want to be working on day in, day out.
Yeah, so I was working in Web2, working at a company called Iron.io. I was on the founding team. It was one of the first serverless companies. And we were a part of Web2, and we were seeing that grow. And I was starting to see VCs and others talk about Bitcoin. And so that was interesting, but I'm like, digital money, I just don't get it. And they were explaining the concept. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure. It doesn't make a lot of sense. In some ways, I could see through it, with just an engineer's perspective of like, I'm not sure how that's going to scale and work. And then after, I don't know, and this probably then in 2015, 16, started, Ethereum and Hyperledger and blockchain, and said, okay, I need to know more about this. And realized that it was really interesting, and it had a lot of parallels to what we were doing in serverless. And I was looking for some new venture and something new, and it was either sticking in serverless or looking at some stuff in blockchain, and realized that, like I said, the parallels between serverless, which was um, tasks and things that, virtual machines for virtual processing, realized that it was very similar, and that, smart contracts are essentially just serverless components. It just happens to be run in a consensus based way. And I realized that that is the new evolution. And so to that point, it, really clicked in and said, okay, blockchain is going to be big, because I could see the extrapolation from serverless computing into blockchain, and that the step from serverless to blockchain means that you just have now a consensus aspect to these smart contracts. Because, having been involved early on in serverless and really propagating serverless, realized that that was the power. And when you realized that everything was going to be automated in many ways and a lot of discrete things, you can understand how you're chaining together um, tasks. You can see how you would chain together contracts, and it became, the wow, the wow moment of wow, this is going to be the next thing. Whereas before it was just Bitcoin and digital money, and I've seen that before in the early 1990s, and I understood it, but I didn't really see that people are really gonna use, Bitcoin in transactions. It didn't seem to compute. Now, when you add it all in with contracts and Ethereum and what Ethereum's doing, and now that you got layer two and you've got the transaction costs lower, it now, makes sense. But early on, I just didn't understand it until we got to the connection between smart contracts and serverless. And then it just became, which one is going to be, what network is going to be the one that's going to be the most important. And it became clear to me Ethereum was there because of the community and more.
So I'm really keen to unpack a bit more about the connections with serverless, because certainly with the different web trends, it's like how with Web2, cloud computing was an enabler, and serverless is tied in with cloud as well. And so I think, as someone who has really lived and breathed that space by building a startup specifically focused on it, and also written about it. I've got this Venn diagram up here that you did a few years back, showing like serverless on one side, blockchain on the other, and you've got these things that are common to both. The fact they're both event driven, fault tolerant, idempotent, and you can have public, private, and hybrid as well. Um, and so I guess it's helpful to level set a little bit, just in terms of what was What did serverless change first and foremost before and why was it such a significant trend?
Yeah, so I got involved with it. With I joined a couple of gentlemen, Travis Reeder and Chad Aramura, and they were doing a consulting company and working on Ruby, but they'd also built this amazing platform to do task-based processing. And it came to the realization that that in itself, that was a product. And so we created a company. They were the founders. I was part of the founding team, Iron.io, and one of the first .ios. So kind of take credit. There was certainly before that, but we helped popularize it. Of course, we had to use .io because nobody could figure out what if you just said iron, and you had to actually include that in the name so that people could find the URL. Um, and it was amazing. We built a lot of it on AWS, and then we started building some of our own underlying components on it, and wrote an article in 2010 that said the future of software is serverless. And we put it on Hacker News, and we got flamed. Oh, bad! It was bad. We got beaten up just because everybody talked about it being clickbait. And but in there you can still read it. It's on Read Write Web. Talked about how what the advantage is, and made the parallels between the electric industry and the power industry, where you would have local power, and then once you had centralized power and transmission lines, things changed dramatically. And the same thing you can see with serverless, meaning task-based processing. You don't have to create monolithic apps. You don't have to worry about servers and how many app servers you need. All you need to do is just create the tasks and then be able to put them on a platform that can scale and provide you concurrency. Now it brings other challenges, meaning how do you string together, where are single points of failure? How do you deal with load balancing, all those things? But it really frees you up from having to worry about and maintaining servers. And so along with cloud computing and virtualization of machines, this was really just virtualization of tasks and almost virtualization of applications, in terms of breaking into microservices, breaking it into tasks. So there, to me, and what was amazing was just to see the aha moments, when you'd see users come in and start playing around with it and being able to fire up 2,000 jobs to do something, and something that might take overnight, suddenly, because they're able to get instant concurrency without having, again, to fire up servers and applications, to see them go, oh my gosh, this is amazing, and the power that you can do. And then looking at how things were done in batch computing, and things still done almost in batch computing. When you look at, nightly reports, or you look at year end or month end, a lot of it is not done concurrently. And if you just turn it into task-based computing and run those, not in parallel, but together, across a whole farm of servers, uh, it dramatically changes not only what you can do, but the time frames you can do it in. So in terms of so I'm not sure where you want to take that, but to me, serverless is pretty powerful, and I think it's still got a long way to run. I don't think people still understand enough of the impact, and especially when you get out into traditional computing, old style, corporate enterprise computing. I'm not sure they really understand the power that serverless brings.
And so in those respects, it was kind of a paradigm shift because, and please correct me if I get any of this wrong, but from what I understand, the serverless technologies, it wasn't like there was a standard API that they used. It was more of an architectural paradigm shift where people would need to think in terms of, rather than having this big batch job, we can in effect have these on-demand tasks that can run and they can arbitrarily scale, but the infrastructure underneath can scale for you know a zero cost in terms of the what you need to fire up to do it. As in, you'd have different cloud platforms, they have their own serverless platforms, and so you could plug into them and say, hey, I need this many compute units or to run this job, and you can tweak, bring that up and down as you please. Is that kind of the right way of talking about it?
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. There's no API. It wasn't like JSON. It wasn't like anything that says, okay, well, this is gonna, you know, we're going to use these APIs necessarily. It was all based. It was more of a how you think about things. It's sort of like the moving from procedural programming to object-oriented programming and thinking about, okay, well, now we've got to do objects and then where the data resides and the functions and the methods. Similarly with serverless, you got to think about how to break things into tasks, what were discrete tasks, but then you also have to think about storage, how you're dealing with storage, how you're dealing with locks you might have to do. And so you got to really figure out in terms of, if there was a lot of sequential stuff, of course, then you were locked into the sort of sequential processing. But in terms of being able to process images that were unrelated, um, create reports, there's ways that you just have to think about how to break up computing process into discrete tasks, but and then also think about storage, about how things might queue, using queues in order to say, okay, well, let's do this function, and then we pass it to this function, and so we'll just put her on a queue and then let another serverless process take it off the queue and process it on its own. So you just learn to how to it's almost like assembly, and assembly assembly lines in terms of like how do we now take these processes and make them discrete, and then discrete functions, and then how do we connect those functions together, but with the use of tasks and queues and storage, we ended up getting NoSQL, and you got a whole bunch of other different types of database structures that made it a lot easier, that you didn't necessarily have to worry about um, you know many single points of failure like you might have with if you're just doing SQL and you go, oh my gosh, we're gonna overload the database if we suddenly have 2,000, tasks doing things and trying to then commit to the database, and so fortunately you had all these different type of structures, like I said, NoSQL and other things that made it a little bit easier to avoid single points of failure or contentions.
And thinking in those terms around there was all these details that you had to get right there. And when we look at Web3 and blockchain technologies, there's, in addition to that paradigm shift in terms of a fundamentally different way of thinking about how they plug into an architecture, and this is something we find ourselves having to re-educate people, as I'm sure you have again and again, that you have stateful information on a blockchain, but you don't have everything on a blockchain, right? But the key, there's at its heart though, one of the what I believe is a very interesting point around blockchains is that you do kind of have a notion of standardization, because Ethereum, right? There's so many different, that in my view is the EVM is the closest thing we have to a standardized protocol, for for Web3, because all these different chains are scrambling to support it and so on. And so, in the same way with serverless, you had all of these availability guarantees and this kind of these scale guarantees. Granted, you don't have quite the scale guarantees with blockchains in terms of the workloads they can handle, but there's kind of, I can see certainly how there's a lot of crossover there. But you also get this standardization, which creates like a layer of abstraction to think about things like tokens and so on.
I think that's a huge thing. I think that's a really underrated element of Web3 and blockchain in terms of the standardization aspect, not only of EVM and the transparency and the smart contracts and sort of this where you have commonality of tasks and languages and introspection of it and transparency, because you can go look at it, you can audit them. I think that's important, but also just that things are now moving into the data layer, and you have a common data layer, a common API layer. Now, not everything is going to be on the blockchain, but a number of things are going to be on the blockchain, and it's going to create, a really commonality. And one of the examples I use to people to try and explain Web3 and NFTs especially is VIN numbers in cars, and how the VIN number in a car, really crosses over every part of the auto industry, from manufacture to repair to purchasing to everything. Every part of the auto, to ticketing to registration. So every part of the auto industry is connected via a VIN number. Now the whole thing is though the VIN numbers are all and all the reports are all in different databases in different structures, and so that's a problem. Now, when you think about the power of a VIN number and what it provides, it's similar how an NFT. and how you'll see that in product codes and you'll see that with products. But what you're going to have now is you're going to have a commonality of data, a commonality of systems. And while some data will still be private and protected, a lot of that schema will be shared. And so you're going to have this tremendous, I don't want to say centralization, but commonality of data and schemas and storage. Whereas, with VIN numbers, like I said, it's all siloed and it's all separate and it's all, God knows what structures. But because you've got EVM, because you've got just sort of these blockchain transactions and the data formats, you're going to see a lot more commonality and ease of use of that data. So I think that is, to me, that's probably three or four or fifth, element of why Web3 is so important. Is the standardization aspect, both in the processing element and in the data recording element. And I think people don't give it as great a credence as they should because it's going to transform, um, many industries because you'll be writing to more common formats. And that's, I think, one of
Yeah,
the
no,
things that allows a tech wave to happen, is that you sort of forget some of the past, or and you can start anew. You don't have to necessarily um, um, play credence to the old schemas. You can invent something new, and you saw that with JSON and REST. They didn't have to work with SOAP. And they were like, okay, let's do things new, and we didn't have this old baggage, and we could do things with REST APIs, and it just took over. And same thing with JSON. There was a lot of formats that didn't really work right because they were complicated, and then JSON came along, and it really opened things up. And I think same thing with this. You've got this new ability, to store data, to record data, and I think and it's relatively simple to do so. And I think that's really going to transform and create new industries, and really new things, that are new applications that are being done that way, are going to move much faster than the older ways that then try and just port to Web3. And you see that in every innovation, that the new things that are built native are always the ones that just take off, whereas the other ones takes a while, because they have to then deal with all that technical debt and baggage.
yes, there's like corporations, I'm sure, off the back of Web 1, when they realized they had to start creating websites. They weren't serving the majority of the internet's users. They were sort of tacking it onto their existing business and trying to figure out how they could make it fit.
It's always the way. We had one of the first internet agencies back in called Vivid Studios. It was the good Vivid. There was another Vivid that was less good, but we were the good Vivid, and we were getting websites for companies, so banks, and I did work for Nike. I mean, you name it, we did a lot of work. So it was us and Organic and Razorfish, and there was a handful of others. And a lot of it, yeah, people wanted to do brochureware. Like, well, take this brochure and move it on. And then it took a couple cycles to really figure out the web was a lot different, and you really needed a structured interface, what people are looking for, what your and really answer, what do people, why do they want to connect with you as a company? And really fascinating times in terms of how we realized, we realized that the web was different than, paper. And it seems obvious now, of course, but back then, it just seemed like, okay, you're just gonna, we're just moving brochureware. We're just gonna move it online and just have some links there.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating point, that, and this is something, one of the reasons I'm so excited to be talking to you about this, because in effect, with each of the major iterations of the web, you've had a startup that you've worked on, and so you can really talk to the ways in which those trends affected businesses, because you were there, like right on the ground, working with these companies, trying to embrace these technologies. And uh, I'm really keen to dig a bit more into that sort of historical perspective there, because there's a degree of things repeating themselves, right? Um, but with this idea of brochureware, and people just trying to replicate what they'd have on print mediums on websites initially, at what point do you think, because you mentioned that companies and sort of figured out how to use the web, but what do you see as those kind of iterations, and at what point do you feel like they started to use it in a way that made sense, and that also their customers started to understand and engage with as well?
Yeah, I think it was when you started thinking about the levels of interaction, and you realized that there were different types of sites. I think originally it was like just move online information online. Let's move catalogs and brochures online and newspapers. And then once you realize that, oh, there was a lot more interaction involved and retailing, and then you sort of got this, I don't know, bifurcation of different types of sites. So then you had this idea of like, oh, we're going to have a corporate website, and then we're going to have other types of properties. We're going to have um, newspapers, but the newspapers are going to become, much different. Obviously you got Craigslist, and Craigslist, took over all of the classified advertising. And so then you had to figure out, well, what is then a newspaper? And the cycles changed because, people, with a newspaper, you were just reading it, once a day. With the web, people were going back all the time. And so the cycles of updating were just, exploded. And so the companies that got that really understood we need to, there were many there was Bleacher Report and others that realized, hey, we need to have much more content, because people are going to be coming back more and more throughout the day as opposed to just a single, read. I mean, you look at a magazine, it's just once a week. You look at a catalog, it's just kind of when you need it. And, but people realize, gee, the internet allows 24/7 access, and people become addicted to, using it, and want a lot more content. And so the sites that were providing that, did really well. And eBay, realizing, hey, people want to be able to look for collectibles and look for items and purchase items. And I think companies realize that their website could be a lot more than just a brochure. A lot of it was help desk and info. And you saw a lot of people realizing, hey, this is a customer support portal, so we need to develop that aspect to it. Or people want to find out more about product information. And so I think they started to realize, like, all the inquiries they're getting at every level of the organization, they realized that they needed to reflect that in their website. Whereas before it was like, okay, this is just a brochure from the marketing team. And then they realized, like, oh, there's other groups that also interface with customers at some level. And then they needed to figure out, okay, well, let's bring that into the website. But that took many years. And then you needed to have the ability for the help desk to be able to respond to emails. And so you needed that structure. Um, and so it took several years, but I think that people realized, it went beyond the marketing team and hit every level of the organization. Investors realizing, like, oh, wait, investors want to be able to connect with us. So we need to have an investor relations section of the website.
Yeah, yeah. And so there was kind of hearing that from you. I'm thinking in terms of two points that struck me anyway when you were saying that. And one of them was the interactivity, in terms of it wasn't just consuming the information; it was having the ability to interact with it. And when people talk about the different iterations of the web, in terms of the web one was all about reading data, whereas web two, because it provided the ability to read and write data as well. And so uh, is it fair to say that it was more with the sort of Web 2 type push that really the web became a lot more functional and really, grew a lot in popularity? Because I know there's the social networks and so on that were on one part of, a big part of Web 2. But does did you feel that enough was kind of figured out during the era of Web 1, or was it not really till Web 2 where things really started to go gangbusters, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it's an evolution. It's technical waves. You've got the first wave was, app servers, and you had the, HTTP, and you had HTML, and you had these basic elements. I think Web 2 was, again, a collection of key technologies, key elements that all came together to make it really easy for people to do things that they couldn't have done before. I mean, you also had higher bandwidth. So it was a culmination of elements in Web 2. So you had, as we mentioned, REST, you had, um, so you had APIs, you had Ruby on Rails, you had these frameworks that allowed you to build apps a lot easier. You had much higher bandwidth. You had Wi-Fi and networks. You had cameras with phones, or phones with cameras on them. And so before you'd have to take a photo, take it to Walgreens, get it digitized, upload it, wait, put it on a site. Okay, nobody's going to do that all that much. They'll do it, but then when you had high bandwidth and you had networks and you had social networks and now the whole thing, but you had much higher bandwidth and you had you could just click, point, upload, share, boom. So it was a combination of elements and a combination of interfaces. Key things like sharing, social networking, um, liking, following, all these paradigms that came around, interface paradigms that together, everybody just grabbed and said, these are amazing. And that ended up giving you all of the network effects and all these things that just grew, exponentially because they grew through a network effect, because you had these, key common interface paradigms that allowed for this network growth. So I think it was a combination again, and talk about Internet 1.0 and the things there, the technology is there, and you talk about Web 2, there's a whole bunch of different, components all the way from the protocol level, to the design interface level. And it was those things that really powered Web 2 and allowed it to be a read write, ability, because you had people being able to immediately, easily be a part of the conversation by being able to upload a video, upload a photo, a bunch of photos, and share those. And so you saw people really being able to be participants because of the ease of the use of technology and the speed of which would happen, and also the interface paradigms that came about. And you're seeing the same thing now in Web3. To me, it's a combination of elements, of protocols, of digital wallets, of consensus-based algorithms, a combination of things that are really allowing NFTs, smart contracts. All these elements are coming together to power new capabilities that people are still experimenting with, but you can certainly see, how infectious and viral they become.
And on that point, with respect to Web3, how does Web3 feel to you at this point versus the other technology iterations you've been through, so to speak? Does it feel kind of on a par with some of them? Does it feel like it is different to some of them in terms of that sort of historical perspective? Where would you put it?
Exactly the same, in terms of, again, the elements, elements all the way from the protocol layer, deep level layer, all the way up to, the interface layer. New technologies, databases being, written languages to address the needs of this community. But the biggest thing is also just the people. And you're seeing younger generations, migrate directly into Web3 because this is where it's at. And because they get it right away. To them, it's very obvious. Gee, this is the way things should be. And they can pick it up just like a kid can pick up a new language. Um, and also just the commonality where you're seeing small companies and working together and then just growing together and becoming, these huge projects. And it's very similar. I think we're a little bit slower on the uptake in terms of the massive outbreaks and the reach into the common, I guess, the normies, so to speak. Whereas the internet, everybody with AOL and others, everybody could jump on and figure out, okay, this is how you use it and this is the benefit. With Web3, it's a much higher bar to get involved, and it's expensive. To go and you buy your Ethereum, it's going to cost, and do something, it's going to cost. To buy an NFT, it's going to cost, and it's not an insignificant amount. And also the theft and the security aspect, so it scares people away. So I think that a few things need to happen in terms of making it a little safer to use, more secure to use. Certainly with layer two, lower cost, things are happening on that way. But I think we're a little slower on the uptake than in the others. But I think from the aspects of the community, the people in the space, it's the exact same vibes I'm getting. It just happens that I'm a lot older and less hair, and don't understand it as much as I did, previously. So I feel like those old guys, the old people in the Internet 1.0 and the Web 2, they just didn't get it. We just shake our heads at them, and I feel a little bit like those people.
But that being said, you are very much so immersed in Web3, and so since And this was the other thing we wanted to get onto in terms of what you're doing now. You're sort of split between a couple of things. You have BuildETH, and you also have the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. If you want to talk a little bit more about firstly how BuildETH came to be as well.
Yeah, really, I realized that m- my skills are just explaining technology, and evangelizing technology. And I really got hooked into the Ethereum community and realized that there's an opportunity, to help build the community. And so BuildETH came around just basically as a way to, I wanted to do conferences. I'd been doing a lot of meetup groups. I'd done GoSF in San Francisco, and SF ETH Dev, and SF Rails, and grown those to, from 0 or 800 to 5,000, each of them, people in San Francisco. And so got used to doing events, primarily just webinar, evening meetups, but we'd get, 200 people showing up to these things. So realized that I had a, ability to organize and host events, and so BuildETH was came around to do that. Also allowed me to do an umbrella to do writing and to do conferences. And so I did several conferences, BuildETH here in San Francisco. A couple of those did the first NFT summit. Worked with Matt Condon and others, and that was really a lot of fun. That was 2017, 18. I don't know, it goes so fast. But then, so unfortunately, COVID kind of came around, and so I'm eager to get back started, with a few. But meanwhile, you got these huge conferences that have just continued, ECC and others. But I like to do things local, San Francisco based, and just bring developers together, um, and allow them to share what they're doing and just connect. Um, and then and then similar to what I work at the EA, it's all about building out the Ethereum community. It just happens the EA, is within the business and commerce arena, but there helped create the events group, basically doing conferences, webinars, and workshops and other activities, again to popularize Ethereum within the business community and allow companies to showcase what they're doing and how to approach, and allow them to be able to approach people in the business community.
And with the time that you've spent on these, how do you feel the Web3's evolved during this time? I mean, first of all, people originally were talking more about blockchain, and now they're talking more about Web3. But beyond the definitions.
Yeah, I'm glad it's Web3 because blockchain is kind of boring. I mean, it's neat, but eyes glaze over when you start talking about it. But when you start talking about Web3 and what the abilities are, the read, write, own capability, the composability of smart contracts, the automation capabilities, the commonality and the standardization that happens with Web3, as you move to EVMs. I think that's really powerful. I think what I'm seeing is similar to what you saw on internet. People think that the internet was all up and to the right. Think it was a steady, exponential growth. But I remember times where we had downturns, 1996 and others, where you had things that, companies and innovations were rocky, and things didn't work, and so you had, a set of companies sort of fall out, and other companies sort of replace them, and so you saw a lot of these sort of mini recessions within that space, and you're seeing the same thing sort of here. You're seeing, you had the ICO boom, and you had the NFT boom. You have, had a lot of ETH killers, alternative layer ones. What hasn't happened though is you haven't had a lot of you had forest fires come, but they haven't cleared out all that brush. The brush is still kind of there. So I think that there's still a lot of companies and ventures and still around that make it difficult, I think, for people to really understand what's going on, because there's so much out there. What, there's 12,000 tokens. That makes it very difficult to understand. If you start to see landscape maps, the ecosystem maps, your eyes start to glaze over because they become very, very complicated. So I think that's one of the things that makes it difficult, I think, for people to jump into Web3. Is it just, there's a lot there. Once you start peeling things away, you realize there's a lot more. There's a lot more turtles, there. It's all turtles all the way down, and so I think that makes it difficult for people to really understand what's happening in Web3 sometimes.
And hence the need, why it's so important to have conferences and sort of people evangelizing it, right? Just to help lift that bar up.
Yeah, I think so. I think so, and also understand that, let people know that it's more about a technical innovation as opposed to speculative. Because I think when I talk to friends out in the neighborhood, they want to talk about certain coins, and when I start to say, "Well, I don't know that coin, but tell me about it," you realize it's on its own layer one. It's trying to do its own blockchain, and they don't even tell what the blockchain is. And so when you explain them, well, no, it really should be tied to Ethereum. It really should be part of the Ethereum ecosystem. It should have, um, tied to the mainnet in some way. But people still don't, they don't see that view of blockchain. They see it as, gee, this is all about just coins, and which coin is going to, go to the moon next. And they don't
Yeah.
understand that really is a whole layer. I mean, to me, the stack diagram you did with EEA way back is still one of the preeminent stack diagrams. And it was seminal to me to look at and go, this is an amazing way to understand, blockchain. And I think more of that needs to happen in terms of, here's the different layers, here's the different, here's where different things are. Sorry for the noise. But I think it really, to be able to lay out sort of the stack is really important, I think, for people to be able to understand, especially investors and others and people, that want to use Web3. They need to understand, how it's all laid out. Whereas people now just look at a coin and say, "Oh, that's going to be cool," but they don't understand all the interrelations of that coin.
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly one can. There is a case in terms of, at least it's captured the imagination of people in terms of working with the technology by engaging with some of these coins and protocols, because in some cases it makes people actually get involved with DeFi, for instance, where they have to learn about how to use wallets and all these kind of more complex bits. And so there is some benefit to it, but yeah, absolutely agree that it, it's far too much of a focus is on that. There's so much more that can be done, and certainly the bigger trend in Web3 is going to play out over the coming years. It's not we're definitely not there yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost, part of me wants to almost create some sort of simple sandboxes for people to be able to understand how to use, Web3 without fear of, without huge cost or learning. Now, maybe that's just me being older. I think younger generations just jump in. They just jump into the deep end, or other people want to, sort of wade in a little bit. And I think that there's this big gap that doesn't. There's no training wheels. There's no, because you have to put money, use money, and sometimes a transaction cost, and there's a lot of scams out there. I think it's very difficult for people to really to understand how to use it in an easy manner. It's not like just going on a browser and great, type in this URL. There's a lot more steps. I mean, to try and get your first Ethereum, you have to go through some hoops to do so.
Yeah, and it just ties back to that whole UX piece, which, as you highlighted with the early days of the web, UX had to be figured out for websites too. So it's whilst it's a different sort of UX, it's still, no doubt, has parallels there.
Yeah, yeah. That's where I'm hoping that we'll see, a lot more advances in terms of just how to represent, certain things. I mean, the thing that drives me nuts is that, in terms of a wallet, that you don't have some simple checksum, capability that's sort of built into the network that allows you to say, here's the address, and when you get the address, it should resolve to XYZ, or some way to, have people confirm that the address that they're going to send money to is the correct address. Because once you send it, it's gone, and it's hard to, you can't pull it back. And so I just think of things like that just, you know would make it easier. You're seeing that now with multi-sig contracts or multi-sig approaches, and I think that's going to help. Both with recovery and protection. So if somebody gets your private key, it's gone forever. So I think that multi-sig and other ways are really going to help. Um, make things a lot safer, I guess, and more secure, and allow a much larger audience to participate. Because then you could have custodial arrangements, um, that still allow you, self-sovereign ownership in certain ways.
Yeah. It seems like that part of the elimination of seed phrases and these sorts of parts with certain approaches does seem close. But as you say, though, the avoiding the black hole of someone putting the wrong address in, that's still a big problem. And right now, it seems like the best solution we have now is to use an intermediary to double check it, which kind of it doesn't sets us back a little bit. More broadly, with the Web3 landscape, what are the areas that you're most passionate about?
Well, certainly, I think it's the layer twos are really interesting. I think you're starting to see last year and this year you're starting to real break out in those. I think there's still a lot of you'll see some certain ones break out more and become more accepted. I think right now it's there's a lot of confusion out there as to which ones and roll ups and etc. And whether other chain based layer two solutions can work. I'm bullish on the chain based ones. I think roll ups I think have issues, but um, I think that's an area that's interesting because it's happening right now. Um, I think the security and UI aspect is really interesting. Um, and then I think just the smart contract still. I mean, I think that especially when you start chaining these together, um, and also just sort of figuring out you know we saw with Luna and Terra how things can just algorithmic stable coins can just go awry. And that, and I think that what you'll start seeing is you'll start seeing breakers being put in and other things that'll happen that will just cause things to sort of stop if things get out of hand. I think right now it's sort of, early programming where you're just doing, you're doing, and you get these infinite loops. And it's like, oh, all right, that just, and so I don't think you've got to now have some protections in there. And so I think that the whole flow of contracts, is really interesting, but also then just breakers and certain checks to be able to stop things from, you know, going, awry, as we've seen. I don't know what that looks like. I'd rather see self-regulating exercises than regulators coming in, and that's what the fear is that regulators are going to come in and say we're the answer, and also custodial wallets. And it's like, no, I'd much rather have it being self-regulating, um, both on the smart contract aspect with breakers and other types of things, as well as on the interface and the wallet and the private keys, with multi-sig. Much rather see it that way than regulators coming in and saying we're going to solve your problems.
Yeah, it's just like the whole thing with how the web has kind of been wrecked by GDPR with all of the cookies pop-ups on all websites these days, and just how much time that wastes for people and what it does to the whole user experience as well is immense impact.
Yeah, I think I think you hit that too, because I think that, you hit that on the head because I think that where we're at now is where we were at when the Communications Act came in back, and that was seminal in, 1996 because it allowed companies to grow without being fear of copyright or defamation or libel because it gave you these safe harbor protections for sites to allow contributors to to do and write things, but these platforms didn't have to be held responsible for them. And so that was huge. And I think that we need something similar here. But I think that what you said is that, now the GDPR is really bogged down the internet and has created this huge frustration of what you can and can't do and for users. And I think similarly that we're at an inflection point within Web3 and that with civil liberties and ownership of data and self-sovereign, personal wallets, and we're at a point where we do need to establish what individuals rights they have, um, and I think that a lot of these things like the GDPR can be solved in cookies because now you're bringing you can bring your permissions with you. And so when you sign on, when you go to a website, it just gives you nothing. And then, okay, if you connect your wallet, that will have your permissions as part of that. And that will have whether it's your GDPR settings that they have to, abide and accept. And so we can simplify a lot of those things with this whole idea of ownership. But I do think that we have to, as a community, really establish, certain rights of the individual. And we've got to do it relatively soon, or else it's going to be taken away from us. I think the regulators will get involved and say, well, this is beneficial to us, um, and I think the civil liberties will be lost and be second, and won't be a priority.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we were to look 10 years into the future, and hopefully the civil liberties haven't been eroded too much by regulators and so on, but how do you, what will be some of the prominent ways that you believe Web3 will manifest itself in our everyday lives?
So I think similar to the way the internet 1.0, in terms of information being extremely accessible. I think in this case, though, it'll be products, real estate, um, that, like, for example, products, you model number, and then you still got to go find and look it up. And it's really kind of hard to warranty information. Um, I think that your car, if we still have cars, I think that, all that will be readily available. And, everything will be, your service record tracked. And so I think a lot of it will be just an extension of this automation of things. And that just as we had access to information, now we'll have ready access to the transaction history of things. And people think, okay, well, that's really bad. I don't want people to know about the transactions. But it's like, well, no, you do want to know about transactions with your car, and other warranty information and other things. So I think that it's really going to make things really simple. And you're going to think like, gee, I can't believe you had to look through multiple databases, and you had to really try and search for that watch component, that repair part and things. Where it's like, no, you just type it in and boom, there it is, just like you do in a Google search. So I think it's going to make things, with products and supply chains, much more transparent. Um, in terms of how socially, that's interesting. That's an inflection point I think we're at. Whereas everything is online, and you can never make a mistake, or we figure out that balance between able to erase things that you don't want to be, or not allow people to see, and have your privacy respected. So I don't know. That's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, and that's why I think that we're at a point where, because blockchain is immutable, and it's like amber, meaning that it holds things forever. We've got to figure out a way that you can be forgotten, or things can be forgotten if you want. So I don't know. To me, it's much more about the transactional aspects, the positive nature, and when you get into the social media and the people and conversations and media, that begins to cause me a little bit of trepidation.
Well, certainly, if we can be in a place where all of this stuff is linked up, and you're not having to constantly search your email inbox to find receipts or just details about products, and that would be a big step forward. It feels like.
Yeah, yeah, I think that see a lot of, and then also just verification of things happening. Um, when you think about all the things with government, oh my God, hopefully we'll able to erase a lot of the paperwork that's needed. That need, and that things will be simplified. So, you just need this, and that's good to go. You don't need multiple things. You have one or two things, and that's all you need to prove something. As opposed to having, especially when you're dealing with government agencies. As a company, you've got, to every agency, you've got to send the same similar information. And I think, if we can just say, here's all the information for the company, go there, pick it up, single source of truth, instead of having all this disparate information around, instead of you having to populate it, in every database, then it's, you just have it in one place and everybody just grabs it. And if it changes, they grab the new stuff. So I think that's going to be really interesting. I think that's going to be a paradigm shift where people are coming to specific sources of information, as opposed to you populating all these different databases around the world with information.
Yeah, absolutely. Make life a lot easier for people as well as these companies. So Ken, if people want to reach out to you or follow what you're up to, are you active on any social media platforms?
Yeah, right now doing with mostly Twitter, and it's a combination of retweeting tech stuff. I'm at Fromm Worldwide, Fromm WW, so FROMMWW, and I've also got BuildETH. I think Build underbar ETH, um, and so people can follow me there. And I'm going to probably start up a Mirror blogging. So instead of Substack or Medium, I think I'm going to go to Mirror. So I've done some stuff writing in the past. Eager to get back and doing more. So mostly just through Twitter, though.
Awesome. Well, Ken, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. And yeah, I look forward to hearing about the next BuildETH conference coming up.
Awesome, awesome. Well, great talking to you, and thanks for having me.
Cool. Cheers.
Cheers.
Hi, it's Conor Svensson here again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm really excited to share with you that I've written a book, The Blockchain Innovators Handbook, a leader's guide to understanding, adopting, and succeeding with this disruptive technology. I've been wanting to share my learnings about blockchain and Web3 for a number of years with a wider audience, and I'm really excited that I can do this now. This book covers everything from the fundamentals of the technology through to opportunity identification and implementation for your business to ensure that you can be one of the big beneficiaries of the wider transition to Web3 that's taking place now. The book is available in physical as well as digital form. For more information, head to web3labs.com/innovators.